Writing All the Water in the World was, a 10-year odyssey that started from a night of not being able to sleep after Superstorm Sandy, because I had been talking to my godfather who, was trying to get the ocean out of his daughter's basement in Red Hook. And I was a single mom, I had a really young child, I had put him to bed, and then I woke up with this voice in my head, and it was this character who, yeah, lived on the roof of the American Museum of Natural History, a museum that I idolized, that I have adored my entire life. It was one of my favorite places to go in New York when my parents would take us to go visit family. I was born in New York City, but, like, spent my life in Massachusetts, until college, and so I had family that was still in New York, and every time we'd go, it was the only place I really wanted to be, and so, she showed up, and I always feel embarrassed when writers say that because it's like, "No, you invented this idea," and clearly it's been sitting with me my whole life, right? Like every other kid who's obsessed with a natural history museum or any museum, you have these fantasies of, like, what circumstances would have to happen for me to get to be stuck here, having to survive after everybody else is gone and having the museum to myself. So I know that those fantasies have been there my whole life, and she just showed up and she just wanted to tell me about what it was like to try and protect the museum after everything falls apart. And I spent a good year writing the first draft, and it was extremely crazily long because I just wanted to go down. I'm a science writer. I just wanted to go down every rabbit hole. I wanted to think about every detail. I wanted to make sure that the science was right, because my mom was a scientist, and we would watch, like the big blockbuster movies that had to do with science, like any volcano movie we would watch together. And every time they got the science wrong, she would just be so taken out of it that she would be like, "But that's not how pyroclastic flow works." So I wanted to make sure I had that. I had survival stuff down. Like I wanted to know the world I was writing about. And it's taken me about 10 years to keep tweaking it, keep learning more information, keep growing as a writer until I knew what structure was gonna help tell her story. But she was the first thing that showed up, and it's never wavered. Yeah, I feel like what I drew on was the people that I knew who do this kind of work, right? Who I again, I my mom went back to school when I was 10, so I went from hanging out with a lot of, like, bohemians and artists to hanging out with a lot of geologists, and conservationists. My dad was a conservationist and also worked, a lot of his work, he made shaker furniture for my whole childhood, my whole life. He taught himself how to make it by hand, and part of what he how he did that was to get to be friends with a lot of museum curators of these little museums of shaker furniture and shaker villages. So I knew these people, and I love them so much. Like, my kid had an internship for 2 years at the entomology department of the Field Museum in Chicago. This was after I'd started writing the book, that has an entomologist as one of the main heroes of the book. But I have worked with entomologists, I've worked with scientists, I've interviewed a lot of scientists, and, like, I just think of them as these really fascinating people who have a calling and a real passion for something. Um, and who have kind of an altruistic and collaborative way of thinking about the world, much like artists do, which is we need to protect something, we need to make something, we need to come together on this larger project. There's no research, there's no curation, there's no scientific inquiry without a huge team of people that are creating this collaborative experience. And I love collaborations. This is part of what I loved about being in a band, right? I still like my bandmates are my favorite humans, right? We have these deep relationships because we've been working together on a big project. And so even though Noni was the voice that showed up, I also, all of the family kind of came in right away along with her with their own things they wanted to talk about. Keller, who is one of, like my favorite character in the book, Keller showed up with like insects and with the history of being, a preacher's kid in Joliet and going to historically Black university. Like, these were things that felt true to the scientists that I've met. The Not just the collaborations, but also the incredible diversity of what a museum or a university or a conference looks like. These are people from all over the world who all have a special focus and a special interest that they're pouring their life into, and that's a really diverse place now. Like, when my mom was getting trained, there weren't a lot of women in her field, but, like, at this point, it's a kind of lovely model for one of the best things about being a human being and about being an American is like you get to be in these spaces where lots of different people are coming together to work on the same kind of project, and move it forward. And so, yeah, having them all there, having them all show up, representing them as realistically as I possibly could was really important to me. I love a disaster book. It's like my relaxation reading. So, I love books about hurricanes and shipwrecks and tornadoes and the Dust Bowl. Like my library is full of shark attack. Like, give me a disaster, it calms me down. Obviously, we can talk about why that's a trauma response from growing up around a lot of death, but whatever, it's my chill time, right? So I always knew that I wanted to have some really big set pieces that were going to convey the magnitude of the potential disasters, right, that we're facing globally. That was always having them be scientifically accurate, but also having them be moving and engrossing and kind of take the reader into what could be really scary about it. That was all really important to me. But I wrote the book, first draft. It's really unusual, actually, because I had never written a novel before, and I actually really didn't know what I was doing, because I'd written only, like, science and nature writing and records, and because I'm used to things being so collaborative, I was like, "I need a team." I think I'm gonna send each chapter as I write it to a bunch of readers, and so by the time I was about halfway through the book, I had 15 readers that were getting a serialized version of the book as I was working on it, and it was all private. I wasn't publishing this anywhere, but I was writing for them to have the momentum of the story keep going so that they knew what was gonna happen next. And I was doing cliffhangers, and I was doing these very meditative chapters about history. I mean, it's an adventure book, but it was really important to me that it not just be an adventure book, that there be thinking about science, thinking about, how what we keep and why, thinking about what makes a society we wanna rebuild, what that looks like. All of that needed to be layered into it, but the momentum kept going because of that, and also, I had the map of the Hudson River, which is, the most majority of the book, they're on the Hudson in, a canoe trying to get north, and I had a bunch of parameters that I knew would be part of the story in terms of, like, what kind of sea level rise would we be talking about. I knew things about the natural history and the geology and the hydrogeology of the river that I fitted in. I knew things about how long and how fast you can go in a canoe in certain circumstances, and I had this great map that's put out by the Hudson River Keepers Association, or it basically is the entire canoe route up the Hudson River from New York as at the present day. So I had that on one side, and then I had a tab open of a website where you can flood the planet to whatever level of sea level rise you're thinking about, that also had, satellite images, so I could see, comparing the map to the satellite, what would be available and around, what kind of places they would come to, how long it would take my characters to get to certain spots, and what they might find there, and the fact of kind of, like, going on this trip with them, in real time to a certain extent, really helped me create that narrative that got them where they needed to go.